Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming, especially with the rain. I've been hearing that that's a big deal in Asheville, so thank you so much for coming out. I want to thank Jeff and everybody at Black Mountain College Museum and Arts Center for making this event possible. It's really special to me. It's also great to see friends and colleagues from various stages here tonight. Thanks so much for coming. And most of all, my love and gratitude to Lorna for the gift of her work and for being in conversation this evening. So as you'll see, I've been thinking about her work for a long time, so it's really special to be here. I'm also convinced that she only hangs out with literary scholars because she's married to such a fantastic one, so thank you so much for being here. So I've approached this talk as an opportunity to share how I came to my research on craft and how that work led me to Lorna's painterly poetics, so giving us a little bit of a framework for the reading that will come after, with some diversions into my own arts practice. So when I first started research for the project that would become my first book, I zeroed in on a set of methodological imperatives that would come to guide my work in important ways. I knew that in writing about visual art in literature and literary cultures, I wanted to shift the focus from product to the materials and processes of making. In my field, scholars tended to study visual cultures in the abstract or finished works of art, as in the analysis of ekphrastic poetry, poems about paintings. But it was far less common to encounter materially driven studies of art, much less serious research on crafted objects, domestic work, etc. I knew I wanted to consider the role of the body in those processes, how embodied experiences shape creative practice. And I wanted to push myself as a scholar to experiment, play, explore, shadow, and most importantly, make things. I expanded my archive from the rare books room to the art studio, to forgotten cardboard boxes, to places and things that challenged the categories of what merits our attention, our study, wanting to understand the archive of literature and art as porous, queer, associative, and liminal. I had a hunch that this set of approaches would infuse my analysis with more specificity, allowing me to think in very nuanced ways about the intersections of women's writing, queer theory, and various modes of resistance. 3 epigraphs at the beginning of my book help orient some of the stakes of the project as a whole. Lorna Goodison prompts us to appreciate the stitching or weaving of the warp and woof of arguments in literary criticism. Anthropologist and material culture scholar Tim Ingold similarly connects the weaver's shuttle laying down the weft to the trail of ink left by a writer. An experimental poet and archivist, Susan Howe, provides an etymological lesson in the connections between text and textile. This assemblage of quotes helps the reader attune herself to the woven nature of the book, invested as it is in both the content of craft alongside the meanings produced by these practices and media. From the beginning, I was interested in bridging theory and practice in my work, a research method that involved an assemblage of approaches informed by hands-on learning, something this audience will no doubt understand as being embedded in the Black Mountain College tradition. I practiced all of the art forms I wrote about, definitely to varying degrees of success, a method that integrates medium specificity and experiential learning into academic humanities research. So here are a few examples from an art quilt I made and exhibited at the University of Kentucky's Bolivar Art Gallery, a conference stitching circle, examining glass plate photographic negatives at Julia Margaret Cameron's house on the Isle of Wight, digital collage as political critique, traditional bobbin lace making, a garmented artist's book, and a film essay called The Weaver's Handshake. Or a few more: painting, glass blowing and bead making, pottery and raku firing, zines, a tintype photograph. My head was latched into a brace for that one, producing a stern look on my face, and a needlework archive that I discovered. for HD, actually, who is represented really well in the library downstairs. So when I set out imagining this book as an object, in addition to the triptych of evocative epigraphs you've already seen, I pictured a hybrid design aimed at reflecting the feminist methodology of my approach to studying craft and literature. It struck me that intensive archival research could be aligned with gut feelings, since both have, in practice, guided my work in important ways. Therefore, crafting feminism extends the literary archive to include the tactile, visual, embodied work of craft, a transmedia feminist archive assembled through both traditional and non-traditional modes of recovery, the inclusion and expansion of voices on a range of feminist and anti-racist approaches to the politics of craft and historical time, and more intimate reflections on assembling this work as an early career scholar and teacher. So the chapters are organized around the media of glass plate photography, needlework, pigment or painting, collage, and digital or critical making, each with a kind of primary author focus. Some of my more serendipitous research encounters do not easily fit into the model of the scholarly book chapter, but they are a form of citation that matters to the larger story I set out to tell in these pages. As an answer to these various claims, each chapter is prefaced by a techne interchapter, spaces of creative encounter that reveal the seams between the chapters and range from the personal to the theoretical. I landed on techne, a term that conveys essential linkages between the ideas of art, craft, literature, and technology, which get woven together by the end. As Henry Stanton explains, the Greek word techne is generally translated as art or craft, but there really is no adequate equivalent in English. Heidegger's explanation for this inadequacy is that we think of art and craft as making or production, whereas techne, he claims, is the kind of bringing forth the Greeks called poiesis, making or poetry, which allows something to emerge of itself. The slippery definition of techne captures both the complexity of writing about craft and queer resistance, as well as the key emphasis on making things, the poetics of craft scholarship. So on this slide, a Louise Bourgeois piece that concludes the book and makes that idea especially visible or visceral even, I would say. So my interest in the experiential, collaborative, and associative dimensions of research practices has been informed by Jane Marcus's notion of the woven story as political resistance, and Nancy K. Miller argues for the feminist value of self-narrative woven into critical arguments. Other scholars like Saadia Hartman and Bell Hooks were extremely influential in kind of thinking through this idea of method and genre. So I often use these techne to pull back the curtain on my research process, tell stories, play with language, to highlight both success and failure, and to represent the teachers who have emerged in the project's liminal spaces of hands-on inquiry. Therefore, chapters on Virginia Woolf, H.D., or Hilda Doolittle, Goodison, Allie Smith, and a coda on Zadie Smith are interwoven with interchapters on a range of other writers and makers, from Rachel Kneebone and Allison Sarr to Mina Loy, who inspired the Black Mountain Poets with her daring poetry. They were frankly obsessed with her, and underappreciated assemblage artworks. She was also enthusiastically published by the Jargon Society. Many of Loy's assemblages were entirely lost to scholars until I discovered and identified an archive of photographs taken by Bernice Abbott of Loy's artworks in her Bowery apartment in New York City. These sections capture the energy of multidisciplinary literary studies, such as in the work of Carbe Wilson, who remixed every word, that's 37,971 words to be exact, of Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own into a new novel called Of One Woman or So, about a multiracial student navigating her education at Cambridge University. I bring readers into the novel, which is unpublished actually, so I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A if you're interested. So I bring readers into the novel alongside my own adventure, meeting Carbe and touring Kettle's Yard, the extraordinary house museum of Jim and Helen Eade in Cambridge, a special encounter that intersected with my curiosity about digital making as a form of craft work and my experience being 3D scanned at the Museum of Art and Design in New York City. So here I am mailed back to myself as a weird little figurine rearranged in miniature. One of my techne interchapters includes a series of reflections on Goodison, even though she's also the primary subject of my next chapter. Although scholars have been deeply interested in Goodison's poetry for years, her connection to the art world, and as we will hear, Black Mountain College pedagogy in particular, had been almost entirely neglected. I'd been captivated by her move from the Jamaica School of Art to the Art Student League, where she won a coveted spot in Jacob Lawrence's painting class. In her memoir, she writes about that period in the late 60s. I credit my time in New York City for force-feeding my senses, its extraordinary sights and sounds overtaking me on a regular basis and producing that spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings that William Wordsworth called poetry. Thus, she replaces the, quote, old system of art history's so-called masters with her own contemporary hero, with Lawrence's depictions of Harlem and the Black diaspora. I became increasingly fascinated by Goodison's references to actual pigments, the earth itself collected and transformed into ink or paint. In her memoir, she makes this relationship both personal through a family story and located in the land itself. She begins her family tree with William and Frances, her great-grandmother and great-grandfather on one side, and George and Lena on the other side. William was English and George Irish. Their wives were Frances from Jamaica and Lena of African descent, called the Guinea Woman throughout many of her poems. George called his grandchildren leprechauns and filled the family's lives with traditional Celtic music and Irish colloquialisms. Goodison explains that George was sent to Jamaica on business, but he abandoned ship when he became captivated by the landscape and fell in love. She writes, "The magnificent blue-green mountains of western Jamaica, the intensely green landscape reminded George Wilson of parts of Ireland, but the weather was much better, with its almost always hot, energizing sun and the warm, clear blue seas with white sand beaches. Paradise. When he abandoned ship, he took with him one thing, a woolen suit that had been woven and tailored by his own father. The wool had been dyed rich black by soaking it for a time in a bog hole, then oiling it with goose grease before weaving it. That suit lasted him for his entire life, and he was buried in it." Irish craft and the most iconic details of the landscape, a bog, form the very fabric of George's Irish Caribbean life. Goodison's connection to Irish culture emerges across her work, such as in the poem Country Sligoville, which connects Sligoville, a town in Jamaica, to Sligo, Ireland, the home of the modernist poet William Butler Yeats. Goodison begins the poem, "I arise and go with William Butler Yeats to country Sligoville in the shamrock green hills of St. Catherine." She takes the reader through the Jamaican landscape, describing the maroon warriors of Jamaican history as bush comrades of Cuchulainn, and concluding the poem with, "Oh, to live Innisfree in a house of wattle and daub." In her rewriting of Yeats's The Lake Isle of Innisfree, Goodison claims her hybrid heritage, giving special attention to issues of freedom and the post-colonial legacies of both nations. George's suit, handcrafted from beginning to end and dyed in the inky bog hole, connects him to his place of birth, but further connects Goodison to handicraft as a site of freedom, as a source of liberation and chosen community. Elsewhere in her memoir, she explains, which is really one of my favorite books, it's so good. Elsewhere in her memoir, she explains that her mother used her sewing room as a kind of community center, teaching young women to sew with the goal of providing them a means of financial independence. She explains, "This was also the room where my mother taught neighborhood girls to sew free of charge so that they could always, as she said, earn a bread and be independent. She sometimes ran the sewing machine like a racing car driver, bending her head way down, her long gray and white plaits curled around her face like slow smoke. There is a constant stream of people, mostly women, coming through the sewing room to see her. They are not all customers. Some come to ask her to read or write letters, to ask her advice, for her help, her opinion." In her shift from past to present tense, Goodison invites us into her mother's sewing room, going on to describe her as a freedom fighter, when it's revealed that she also uses this woman-centered space as a way to help women escape abusive relationships. Goodison turns her craft to the page as a writer and to the canvas as a painter, continuing her mother's legacy through works across media that interrogate the racism of history and champion communities of care. I've been so thankful to see a range of Goodison's paintings, drawings, and multimedia works, which I study alongside her poems, short stories, and life writings. See, for example, the paintings on her book covers. Here, just a selection. They're wonderful. And drawings in the manuscript versions of the poems, where notes, drafts, and doodles commingle, such as one of my favorite pieces in the Golden Grove Manuscript Collection at the University of Toronto. Or two wonderful watercolor paintings, one from the Toronto Archive and another a gift from a friend, both of which evoke for me Goodison's first book of poems, Tamarind Season, from 1980. See here the cover and the illustrations. My aim is not to establish any primacy of art over poetry or even to put them in tension with one another, but to show how the media of these practices overlap and enrich each other. I've been instructed by Goodison's own deep investments in these questions, a relationship reflected in her retirement gift from the creative writing department at the University of Michigan in 2014. Wolverine Press, headed by Fritz Swanson and staffed by MFA writers, created a hand-printed broadside of To Make Various Sorts of Black, which is encased in a light brown envelope featuring the colophon and 5 swatches of the handmade inks cited in the poem: scorched stone of peach, scraped shell, soft stone, vine twig, and lamp black. Sounds a bit like an Imagist poem in and of itself. When I started researching Goodison's painting, I wanted to understand its craft, to trace the materials and processes that inform her work. This approach and this poem led me to the geographic and aesthetic wonders of pigment. As her poem, To Make Various Sorts of Black, shows, Goodison is a scholar of pigment, tracing ideas about blackness and resilience through a diasporic timeline of makers and studying the very recipes that create ink, ink being the medium of handwriting, printing, and painting. In making their broadside, Wolverine Press understood the importance of ink's material properties to Goodison's work, and they recruited Toronto-based ink maker Jason Logan to make the inks in the poem according to Cennini's 15th century recipes, which Goodison cites in her very first lines. As Swanson wrote to me in 2015, the really satisfying discovery, which you will see when you receive a copy of the edition, is that the inks perform exactly as described in the poem. The envelope also includes Logan's reflections on making the inks for the project, such as the relationship between process and color saturation. For example, scraped shell black was made from manila clam shells baked, blackened, and crushed, powdered and recooked, mixed with overcooked Indian shellac flakes, iron sulfate darkened hand-harvested Canadian sumac fruit, and water. See what I mean about medium specificity? It's a lot of detail. resulting in gray-black and glossy, or the scorched peach stone black, produced with oven-charred peach stones, ground in water bound with gum arabic, resulting in matte grayish blue-black. In the end, the process leads Logan to the conclusion that, without question, each ink contains a story. The press kindly sent me the set of 5 ink pots they used in the making of the broadside, and I was very keen to listen in on the stories they might tell. Using the set of black inks, I made 2 experimental paintings of carved wooden birds in their craftsperson's hands. So these images are based off photographs taken by the Irish writer Sarah Baum, another crafter writer I interviewed for the Los Angeles Review of Books after visiting with her in Skibbereen, which is another kind of adventuresome journey to the west coast of Ireland. She carved and painted, this is Baum, carved and painted small wooden birds which illustrate her book, Handiwork. Driving me to write with more specificity about color and pigment in Goodison, these experiments with ink showed the medium making meaning in its own bubbly, oozy ways. My longer reflections in the book on pigment and ink theorize these aesthetic relationships as a key resource for reading diasporic literature. As I finished this work and saw it into the world, I began making my own foraged handmade inks and experimenting with their magical alchemy. Ink and other layered media, such as the pulp of hand paper making, collage, and cyanotype that I'd used in my focus on process and materiality, eventually culminated in a few different projects, one being a 20-piece art series called Theories of Making, so on the slide are a selection of those. In my work, I aim to celebrate the layered archives of art that circulate, resurface, and inspire new works. Some feminist scholars have given this phenomenon the term resonances, a way to describe the echoes of influence felt, as Y.G. Dimmock describes it, in the fabric of the text. It feels particularly apt to be in this space as I reflect on the ways in which art and literature have inspired a method of research, and how we might observe and then practice the resonances of craft. In that spirit, I'm looking forward to continuing to resonate with these questions with Lorna, who will now share some of her work and reflections on studying with Jacob Lawrence. Thank you so much.
My great-grandmother was a Guinea woman. Wide eyes turning the corners of her face could see behind her, her cheeks dusted with a fine rash of jet bead warts that itched when the rain set up. My great-grandmother's waistline was the span of a headman's hand, slender and tall like a cane stalk, with a Guinea woman's antelope quick walk, and when she paused, her gaze would look to see, her profile fine like some obverse impression on a Guinea coin from royal memory. It seems her fate was anchored in that unfathomable sea, for my great-grandmother caught the eye of a sailor whose ship sailed without him from Lucy Harbor. Great-grandmother's royal scent of cinnamon and scallions drew the sailor up the Straits of Africa, and evidence was my blue-eyed grandmother, the first mulatto, taken into Bacchus' household and covered with his name. And they forbade great-grandmother's Guinea woman presence. They washed away her scent of cinnamon and scallions. They controlled the child's antelope walk, and they called her uprisings rebellions. But great-grandmother, I see your features, blood dark appearing in the children of each new breeding, and the high brown is darkening down, and listen, children, it's your great-grandmother's turn. Good evening. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming out. Thank you to the wonderful Amy. I was weeping in the back there. This was just wonderful. Thank you, thank you. And thank you to my new friend, Jeff. Thank you for having us here, Jeff. And all you lovely people who left your homes on a rainy Saturday afternoon. To make various sorts of black, according to the craftsman's handbook, chapter 37, Il Libro dell'Arte by Cennino d'Andrea Cennini, who tells us there are several kinds of black colors. First, there's a black derived from soft black stone. It is a fat color, not hard at heart, more a stone unctioned. Then there's a black that is obtained from vine twigs, twigs that chose to abide on the true vine, offering up their bodies at the last to be burned. Then quenched and worked up, they can live again as twig of the vine black, not a fat, more of a lean color, favored alike by vine dressers and artists. There's also the black that is scraped from burnt shells, markers of Atlantic's graves, black of scorched earth, of tart stones of peach, twisted trees that bore strange fruit. And then there's a black that is a source of light from a lamp full of oil, such as any thoughtful guest waiting for bride and bridegroom who cometh will have. A lamp you light and place underneath, not a bushel, but a good, clean, everyday dish that is fit for baking. Now, bring the little flame of the lamp up to the undersurface of the earthenware dish, say a distance of about 2 or 3 fingers away, and the smoke that emits from that small flame will struggle up to strike at clay, strike till it crowds and collects in a mess or a mass. Now wait a while, please. Before you sweep this color, now sable velvet soot, off onto any old paper, or consign it to shadows, outlines, or backgrounds. Observe, it does not need to be worked up nor ground. It is as perfect as it is. Refill the lamp, Cennini says, as many times as the flame burns low, refill it. Guernica. On the 3rd day, I went with Seymour Leichmann to the Museum of Modern Art, there to see Picasso's Guernica. And a woman bearing a lit lamp burst through the casement at the upper left-hand corner of the canvas, and the disemboweled horse screamed. Swift sleight of hand, Basque woman dropped fire into the niche Coltrane had split with the lip of his horn. Turpentine top notes, base notes of linseed oil, scent of painters' studios can cause salt to wash my eyes. It was originally my intention, and that is why I had come, to become a maker of most marvelous pictures. So I apprenticed for some time in the studio of Brackman, and then under master painter Jacob Lawrence, a great man. Don't look to the right or left, just do the work. Do the work. Slip past those petty guards at the Metropolitan's gates who will seek to dispatch you on their fool's errands, and just do the work. Do the work, good Jacob said. Do and do the work. I was fortunate enough to take a class with Jacob Lawrence at the Art Students League in 1969. And Mr. Lawrence was, well, okay, I'll just tell you 3 things about him, maybe 4, or a couple of things. When I went into his class, because, I'd waited to be able to get in, and I finally got in. I was so happy. I was sort of beaming in the back of the room. And anyway, he came over and he said to me, I understand you're from Jamaica. And I said, yes. And he said, did you know about Richmond Barthé? I don't know, you all know Richmond Barthé was this extraordinary sculptor who's somehow his work has just gone. I hope his time will come back around again. And, but he was a very finely tuned person. He felt things very deeply. And he just escaped to Jamaica and lived in the bushes of St. Mary and worked there for years. He just couldn't face what was going on in this part of the world. And my sister was a journalist and really a big deal in Jamaica at the time. took me one day to go visit him up in St. Mary. So I could, in fact, say to Mr. Lawrence that, yes, I'd seen Mr. Barty and he was doing well. And so because of that, then we started sort of hanging, well, I wouldn't say we're hanging out, but he would talk to me sometimes. And I was very touched by the fact that he was so concerned about his friend and his welfare. And I think a lot of that concern for others and his people came out in his work and what he was doing. And one of the things I found really, really absolutely beautiful was that if he felt his method of teaching was that if he felt that an anecdote, a story, sharing some personal thing with you would help move the painting along, he'd tell you. And this is, he was not sharing kind of guy. He was very taciturn. But I remember I was sort of giving up on something, and he said, look, when I was a young child and I wanted to see great pictures, I wanted to be able to go into the big museums in New York and look up great paintings. He said, sometimes I'd get there and the guard wouldn't let me in. That was just how it was. He said, but I soon figured out that if I went around the corner and waited, that guard would change, and sometimes the next one would let me in. So he said, look, just think about that. And that has helped me in more situations than you will ever know. Sometimes just wait, and just wait till that grumpy guard leaves. The next one might let you in. I actually have a student who managed to get herself sketching at the Donald Trump trial in New York. Because of that, she said she waited until somebody smiled and they let her in. She wrote him and she said, Lorna, Mr. Lawrence's advice got me into this. And yeah, it works, okay? But the other thing he taught me, which helps me on a daily basis as well, he says, he used to insist that you keep all areas of the painting going at the same time. People talk about work-life balance, I guess, or things like that. He said, otherwise, when the painting is finished, it's going to show that you are off in the, painting the reeds by the river and leaving, the rest of the painting to fend for. He said, no, just always keep checking yourself that you're working at all areas of the canvas at the same time, giving it equal attention. But more than anything else, he kept saying to me, just do the work. Don't overthink the work. Don't over-discuss the work. Don't overshare about the work. Just do it. And I'm very, moved by people who can tell you what they're doing, because very often I have no idea what it is I'm doing until much longer after. So that helped me sometimes, when I would hear him say, Lorna, don't say anything, just do the work. So Amy has done the work and done the work so marvelously. Can we just give her a round of applause again? And with that, I'll just read you a couple of poems. Is that all right? This poem is called Passing the Grace Vessels of Calabash. And people in my part of the world, I'm from Jamaica, we have had to argue with people who said that there was no art before people were trained according to European methods. And some of us say, no, that's not true. Because one thing, enslaved people, every single person was an enslaved person who worked on a sugar estate. They all had gourds, or what we call a calabash, or you call a gourd. And these gourds were always intricately carved. There were all sorts of symbols on them. And the second, there are two poems, Passing the Grace Vessels of Calabash. And the second one is Who Was the Mother of Jamaican Art? And Who Was the Mother of Jamaican Art is a poem about art, because when some enslaved women had children sold away from them, under that system, some people, historians refer to it as social death. You didn't own anything, and certainly not your children. So when your children were sold away from them, some women would carve these little wooden figures representing the babies and hang them from a rope around their necks. And before they eat, they'd offer the babies something, which is, anyway. So we are saying that was art too. Passing the grace vessels of Calabash, our foreparents carved on, lest they forget, maps, totems, symbols, and secret names, creating art when some would claim we existed in beast state. Every Negro in slavery days had their own hand-engraved calabash. So they drink water from grace vessels, their lips kissing lips of maps, leading back to Africa, to villages where relatives waited for years before they destroyed the cooking pots of the ones who crossed. So who was the mother of Jamaican art? She was the first nameless woman who created images of her children sold away from her. She suspended those wood babies from a rope around her neck. Before she ate, she fed them, touched bits of pounded yams and plantains to sealed lips, always urged them to sip water. She carved them of heartwood. Teeth and nails were her first tools. Later, she wielded a blunt blade. Her spit cleaned face and limbs. The pitch oil of her skin burnished. When woodworms bored into their bellies, she warmed castor oil and they purged. She learned her art by breaking hard rock stones, and she did not sign her work. This is a poem for a friend of mine, Seymour Leichman, who I mentioned earlier on. Was a wonderful painter. Again, my friends are painters, who I think everybody should know about. But it's called Studio 2 Seymour. The winter after she left him, he made pictures of flying women, line drawings of long-tressed, lithe, comely women in flight, often heading out over the Hudson, leaving just their trunks and legs to remain in the composition. Some faceless ones would enter headfirst into the chaste square of Archie's paper, half in, half out, constructed to be always without his complete vision and framing. And this is another poem about floating women. It's called a Max Ernst painting. That floating woman without a head, her left arm missing, that woman wearing one translucent pink stocking, levitates in a blue space, rags and feathers shudder from vents in the ceiling. Someone just threw a stone at her. See it drop to the base of the picture? Maybe it was a stone that decapitated her. There is a conical red stroke falling from an indigo mass below where the rags and feathers blow. That woman with her head partly gone, she's partly a nun, partly a naked Maya. And her left arm connected to her heart grew weary of constantly reaching out, and returning empty, it fell into the sea. About her head, you know how I said it was severed by a stone? Well, I suspect it was thrown by someone who had no sins they wished to speak of. I don't like this cutting up women in pictures in the paper. It's a poem for another obscure painter, a Jamaican painter called Henry Daly. And he died, okay, the poem is called Hungry Belly Killed Daily because apparently he died of hunger, malnutrition and hunger. It was in 1940. That was not a great time to be saying you're a painter in a society like the one I come from. I fancied that I could paint a still life with food, and my rendering of victuals would be so good that I could reach into the canvas and eat and fill my belly. Cadmium yellow could spread, butter impasto over white lead or a brown loaf baked of sienna. Scarlet and vermilion, the wine would flow. Otaheite apple is a dark red rose madder. If I could fill my hungry belly with painted wine and bread, but they shot my visions from my head instead at Bellevue, where they send madmen or black men mad enough to think they could be artists in 1940. It's a poem for Keith Jarrett, and I'll read this for Jeff, who's a drummer, great jazz drummer. I'm sure like me, he loves Keith Jarrett, all right? Keith Jarrett, Rainmaker. Piano man, my roots are African. I dwell in the center of the sun. I am used to its warmth, I am used to its heat. I am seared by its vengeance, it has a vengeful streak. So my prayers are usually for rain. My people are farmers and artists, and sometimes the lines blur. So a painting becomes a December of sorrel, or a carving heaps like a yam hill, or a song of redemption wings like petals of resurrection lilies. All these require rain. So this Sunday, when my walk misses my son's balance on my hips, I'll be all right if you pull down for me waterfalls of rain. And I never thought a piano could divine, but I'm hearing you this morning and right on time. It's drizzling now, and I will open the curtains and watch the lightning conduct your hands. I think. Vincent and the Orient. The blackbird in the bougainvillea bush brushes against the powder blue sky, and the carnelian froth of the flowering tree, and the way that this picture framed itself inside my window makes me remember Vincent and the Orient he would imitate, Japonesery, white petal trees set spare in an eastern landscape. They are not my favorite. Dearer to me are those in which familiar things turn transcendent. Golden cornfields shimmy like blonde dancing girls, hips rolling, abandoned, fecund. The red turban of a zouave's uniform pulses like a live internal organ. Strange how I never meditate upon the hard details of his death, but see instead the glory of his gift for transforming elementary things through patience and careful seeing, past obvious appearances, down to where the whirling spirits flash primal pigments, creating images. Sensuous, duende, amazing. Okay, I'll just read one more. It's called, this last poem is called La Casa dos Dorados. And we were in Spain and Portugal some years ago, and I was walking by this shop called La Casa dos Dorados. And in the window was this carving, I think of a saint, except she had no clothes on, but some thoughtful person had painted on her underwear. I guess in case for a day like that when she found herself in a shop window. Okay. Thank you very much for coming. La Casa dos Dorados. The shop of saintly relics, you called it, where she was on display in her painted-on underwear. And the clerk dissembled when, pressed to identify the icon of a black woman, one ruler and a half high, limbs hinged, so she sat upright on a ladder-back chair, knees together, feet sheathed in ankle boots, straight-laced, sweet-faced, embarrassed to be seen not properly dressed in a shop window in the Alfama district. You insist you need to know who she really is. You wait till the owner is summoned. His best guess is, she's Our Lady of Montserrat, Black Madonna. What could have brought her to this? Why has she stripped off her clothes, to expose her thin white tempera, chemise, and bloomers. Our Lady's home is on a Barcelona mountain. Attempts to bring her to the plains failed. Believers make pilgrimage to our shrine of miracles, but she's come down to us this day. You're in the valley of the shadow, the dark. Lady has come to accompany you through this pass on the path where consolations withdraw. Now do like her. Be still. Yield up all outer. Thank you very much.